السلام عليكم، معكم محمود العيسى، وأهلا وسهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من برنامج نقطة أساس. الدكتور نيك بايجتش هو الابن الأصغر لعضو الكونغرس الأمريكي الراحل عن ولاية ألاسكا نيك بايجتش الأب، وهو معروف في ألاسكا بأنشطته السياسية الخاصة. تم انتخابه مرتين رئيسا لاتحاد المعلمين في ألاسكا ومجلس التعليم في انكوراج، وهو من مناصري البحث المستقل في العلوم. حصل بايجتش على الدكتوراه في الطب التقليدي من الجامعة الدولية المفتوحة للأدوية التكميلية في نوفمبر عام 1994، وله مجموعة كتب قيمة. ظهر كضيف على آلاف المحطات الإذاعية التي تقدم تقارير عن أنشطته البحثية، بما في ذلك التكنولوجيا الجديدة والصحة وترددات الراديو وأجهزة الإرسال الجيوفيزيائية والبيئية. في هذه المادة يقدم لكم بايجتش تحليلا شاملا ودقيقا عن خلايا العقل البشري وكيف يمكن التلاعب بها عن طريق إرسال اهتزازات أو ومضات ضوئية، ويقول أن هذه الأفكار وجدت نظريا في العديد من الكتب، منها كتاب لبريجينسكي الذي كان مستشار الأمن القومي في إدارة جيمي كارتر. ويقول بايجتش أن اهتمام الجيش بمثل هذه التكنولوجيا جاء مباشرة بعد الحرب الكورية، حيث أنهم اكتشفوا أن الجنود العائدين من الأسر بدأت تظهر عليهم تغيرات سلوكية غير عادية، وبدأ البحث والتحقيق لمعرفة حقيقة ما جرى لهؤلاء الجنود. وفي الستينات وأثناء حرب فيتنام تم الاستيلاء على جهاز يسمى ليدا من الروس، تم استخدامه في استجواب السجناء الأمريكيين في فيتنام. معلومات قيمة ستستمتعون بمشاهدتها في هذه المادة الفيلمية. متابعة طيبة.
Today we're going to be talking about mind control in the 21st century. But first, let's give a little bit of background on who I am. I'm Dr. Nick Baigtsch. I was born and raised in Alaska. I have a doctorate in traditional and complementary medicines and a background in politics here in this part of the world. I've been active on these issues and issues on technology throughout the world. I've lectured in 22 countries all over the United States. I've worked with 200 radio and TV producers around the world to get these issues into the hearts and minds of folks so that we can really debate and look at what the potential is, both on the positive side of technology as well as some of the things that we all need to be concerned about and look out for. Here in Alaska, I also work as a tribal administrator for Chickaloon Village, one of the federally recognized Native American tribes in Alaska. I worked as an administrator in public education. In the last 10 years have been actively engaged primarily in activist work surrounding these issues. Most recently, I was appointed Executive Director of the Lay Foundation on Technologies based in Dallas, Texas, to take technology issues forward, to educate the public so that we can all be more informed as we move forward into this century. First, let me give a little bit of background on this whole area. You know, the military's interest in this area goes back to the Korean conflict. Right after the Korean War, returning veterans, prisoners of war, had really unusual behavioral changes. In fact, as our military began to look at these guys and find out what was going on with them, we found out that huge psychological transformations were made. These were made through lots of different methods, mainly affecting the emotions of folks. What happened as a result of this is our military and others became very interested in the idea of manipulating human behavior for lots of different purposes. I mean, obviously, in prisoners of war situations, the idea of interrogating folks where they're more liable and susceptible to giving the information up was the main emphasis during the Korean conflict, and of course was of interest to our military as well. From the 1950s, things changed pretty dramatically. As we rolled into the 1960s, a lot of interest into the idea of electronically controlling what happens within the human brain was being pursued. In fact, in the early part of the Vietnam War, back in the mid-60s, a device called the LIDA machine, L-I-D-A, was captured from the Russians. It was used in interrogating U.S. prisoners in Vietnam. And essentially what it was an oscillating strobe light mixed with auditory signals that actually caused what's called brain entrainment, the idea of the brain beginning to mirror or follow those external signals. And what this did is put people in a highly suggestive state and a state where they were more willing to give up intelligence. This particular device triggered a whole cascade of interest, primarily from Central Intelligence Agency. In fact, it was right after this period of time in the early 70s that this whole adventure became of interest to our U.S. Congress. Back in 1975, the United States Congress did a full analysis of what the Central Intelligence Agency was doing in the United States. And within that analysis, they published this report. And this is a report on the activities within the United States. And if people remember, the Central Intelligence Agency was supposed to be dealing with things only off of our shores, not within our boundaries. Now, in the 60s, the CIA was used for infiltrating student groups, getting involved in surveillance of everyone from the Congress all the way through activist organizations, individuals through the United States. During the same period of time, a huge controversy broke, and it was the MK Ultra controversy. And this dealt with the idea of taking individuals, utilizing primarily chemical means, LSD and other mind-altering drugs, to see if you could alter behavior in a favorable way for military adventures. In fact, the abuses that were engaged at that time are actually spoken about in this congressional report. The sad story is that of all of the victims, thousands of military personnel used in these experiments as well as others, never once was the government fully held accountable until one individual actually committed suicide. That resulted in a lawsuit that eventually was settled by the Central Intelligence Agency in favor of that individual who was subjected to this kind of experimentation. At Laurentian University in Canada, similar work was being done, really developing methods, protocols for influencing human behavior without chemical means. If you even go back to the 60s again for a few minutes, and let's talk about another guy. This guy was Jose Delgado. Jose Delgado put together this book. This is Physical Control of the Mind Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society. Jose had his degree in electrophysiology from the University of Madrid. He was granted his degree in 1950, and once achieving that degree, he spent his time sort of mapping the brain, looking at what parts of the brain affect various parts of our behavior and activity. What he found was that the brain could be mapped, that you could actually implant electrodes within the brain and get a number of effects. And some of that he was doing with primates. He was doing it with bulls as well. In fact, this image is Jose Delgado with a charging bull coming at him. He threw a radio transmitter, threw the switch on it, and basically stopped the bull, not dead, but stopped it dead in its tracks, where it stopped the charge. This was done in 1969. Now, back in 1969, Jose Delgado had left Spain, had come to the United States, was working primarily at Yale University in this work, where he continued his work until the mid-80s. What he found is that he was able to stimulate the brain utilizing an implanted technology and cause a number of effects in primates, bulls, and even human beings. By the 1980s, he found that he didn't need any physical contact with the human brain. He just needed to oscillate or vibrate energy into the brain in a very specific way. And what he found in 1985 was that you could create tremendous changes in human brain chemistry by oscillating energy in at 1/50th of what the Earth naturally produces in the radio frequency range. Now, if you think about that in a broader sense, how much radio frequency energy is around us right now at this moment is about 200 million times more than nature produces on its own. So take what nature produces on its own, cut it down to 1/50th of that amount of energy, and that was what was sufficient to override human brains and primates in such a way as to change them from, say, lethargic and passive to highly aggressive and agitated, almost like throwing on and off a light switch. This was documented in work at Yale University. This work has also been documented in our books, which is part of the basis of this series, the Earth Rising, the Revolution, and Earth Rising, the Betrayal of Science, Society, and the Soul. And in these two books, we actually lay out over 1,000 reference sources, laying out exactly where each bit of information comes from, primarily quoting mainstream media reports, academic studies, unclassified military records, and work done in a number of institutions around the world. On this subject, we were also pretty impressed by the idea that finally one of the leading publications in the world, The Economist, actually took this issue on in this cover story from the end of May 2002. And in this cover story, the beginning of the dialogue, the debate on the ethics of mind control, the ethics of artificially manipulating the human brain for military applications. If you take it a little bit further and we start to look at sort of what did the military do during the 60s that was the most impressive, the thing that struck me was not the chemical test, because those are pretty obvious to everyone. It was the idea, more in line with what Delgado and others were utilizing, which was this idea of oscillating electromagnetic fields of various kinds. The radio frequency energy was as being one of those primary movers. As we looked into the history of the technology, what we were able to find is over 36 U.S. patents tracing the evolution from the early 1960s primarily up until the beginning of this century. And many of those you'll find available on the DVD as reference material that goes with this presentation, because we want people to have those hard documents and access to that information directly. The other thing that I would say in terms of military applications, it became pretty interesting as we started to see the evolution of the technology, and we started to see writers like Zbigniew Brzezinski, when he was at Columbia University, take this issue on. If you go back to this book, Between Two Ages, this was written by Brzezinski before he became National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter when he was President of the United States. And within the context of this book, startling things start to emerge in terms of the technology and where it's going. One in particular that was an interesting idea, the one fielded by a researcher named Gordon J.F. MacDonald, and I'll just read this short quote. He was a geophysicist specializing in problems of warfare, and this is what he thought was possible. J.F. Gordon MacDonald, a geophysicist specializing in problems of war, has written that accurately timed, artificially excited electronic strokes could lead to a pattern of oscillations that produce relatively high power levels over certain regions of the Earth. In this way, one could develop a system that would seriously impair brain performance of very large populations in selected regions over an extended period, no matter how deeply disturbing the thought of using the environment to manipulate behavior for national advantages. To some, the technology permitting such use will very probably develop within the next few decades. This was written in 1973, and in those last few decades, that is exactly the technology that has emerged and the technology we'll be discussing today. Some of the other areas that became pretty interesting, and it wasn't just to us, but others were looking at this whole idea of weapons advancements and technology as it could affect human behavior on a large scale, covering the entire planet, and then something much more narrower. The things that Brzezinski was talking about was this idea of being able to oscillate energy in such a way that you could create a signal that would return to the Earth in such a way as to alter behavior. How does that work? Let's talk a little bit about the mechanisms behind brain entrainment and what exactly that means. Affecting human behavior, affecting the brain, can be done in a number of different ways. Firstly, you need to look at sort of what are the predominant brainwave activity within the brain, and how does that line up against what we generally know. Let's break it down into four areas. We're going to talk about alpha waves, beta waves, theta waves, and delta waves. And we're going to start with the deepest states of human consciousness. When you're totally knocked out, deep sleep, you're in this deep delta state, which is approximately 1 to 4 hertz or vibrations per second or pulses per second. If you looked at an EEG to look at that brain activity, you'd see this sort of pulsing energy within this range of 1 to 4 hertz. The next level up is called theta. Theta runs between approximately 4 and 7 hertz, or pulses per second or vibrations per second. This is the place that most people are when you're sort of in between awake and asleep, where you're consciously dreaming but you're still unconscious, but you have that sort of in-between state. That's the theta state. This is where most 3 to 5-year-olds spend most of their time. If you were to look at an EEG of their brains, this is where the predominant activity is, which gives a clear explanation of why sometimes it's difficult for young children to separate the imaginary world from the real world. It's because of where they generally live. But in this same place of where their brains are, where they absorb tremendous amounts of information, you think of 3 to 5-year-olds in terms of language skills, social behavior, the kinds of things they're learning. The other thing that happens is we shove kids into an early frame of learning, where the brains aren't fully developed for the kind of academic studies that many of us push our kids into maybe a little bit too prematurely. As an example, in Europe, they don't even start children in school till usually 7 years old versus the 5 and 4-year-olds being started in school in the United States and in preschool programs. Now, the next stage is the alpha stage. This runs approximately 7 to 12 hertz. This is where you are when you're in the zone, when you're focused, when you're as an artist or an athlete, where you're just at your optimum performance. For accelerated learning, for certain particular types of learning, this is extremely useful brain range to be in. It's where you want to be for intellectual work and creative work. The next level is beta. This is where you're actively engaged, thinking and learning. At the same time, there's a little bit more emotional content in terms of the dialogue. As you get to high beta, you get into those agitated states or states where we're not in as good a control of ourselves as we like to be. So the range, if you're looking at children that function, say, at too high a beta, these are folks that are attention deficit disordered, often cataloged in that way. Also, if they're running theta, they're running too low of a frequency range. Oftentimes we categorize children as learning disabled. And yet, really what may be happening in many instances when we diagnose too early is the brain just hasn't fully developed to where the alpha rhythms and the beta rhythms tend to dominate the waking state, which is where we want to be as adults. The interesting thing in terms of study is what was discovered early on, originally by Delgado and others, was the idea that external fields, when they were coherent or rhythmic and followed very specific patterns, could override the activity of the normal brain. And this could be done with pulsating radio frequency signals, pulsating electromagnetic fields, with oscillating light or pulsating light, and it could also be done with sound. Now, if you think about sound, sound waves and sound itself, for the human ear to perceive it, we don't perceive the very, very low frequency sounds. Animals like elephants can perceive those low frequency sounds. Other animals that have large receivers, ears that pick up those low frequency sounds can do that, but we can't. So what happens is the brain, not being able to hear below a certain range, cannot pick up these low rhythms that can cause brain entrainment unless you can create sort of a cancellation effect. And here's what's been developed. A gentleman named Robert Monroe, back in the late 1950s, early 1960s, discovered that if you sent sound into one ear at, say, 16,000 cycles per second or vibrations per second, within the range of human hearing, and one in at, say, 16,007 in the other ear. So you have 16,000 coming in here, 16,007 coming in here, and they cancel within the brain and leave a beat frequency of 7 hertz. Within the alpha range, as an example, the brain locks onto that beat frequency, and this is called binaural beat. It was actually patented by Monroe. It was used to develop a number of technologies, but the real effect of binaural beat is pretty profound. If you look at this image, and this is an image taken from the Monroe Institute, you can see a normal brain on this side, which the energy is distributed across the brain, with one side, in this case, dominating, where the energy is focused in the reds and the yellows on one side of the brain. With binaural beats, you create what's called whole brain entrainment, where both hemispheres of the brain, both the creative side and the analytical side, harmonize and work together. This is the ideal state of learning, the ideal state for absorbing information, taking it into consciousness and committing it to long-term memory, and also having profound effects, very strong effects, suggestive effects on the human brain and subsequent behaviors. As a result, Over 60,000 people were tested at the Monroe Institute utilizing this technology, and actual tapes and CDs were developed for creating very specific behavioral effects for enhancing human performance, not for necessarily military applications, but for civilian applications in a number of areas. And we'll talk about that as we go on through this presentation today. The main interest, again, of many was the idea of being able to enhance performance. I mean, consider the fact that brain activity in young children, how do we moderate that now? I mean, when kids are hyperactive, we drug them. When they're attention deficit disordered for other reasons, we drug them. And the idea there is to get them to slow down enough in order to make the kinds of intellectual processes work so that things do work properly. Now, there's other ways to accomplish this, and one of the most outstanding programs in the country was actually initiated in a charter school in the Minneapolis School District. Minneapolis School District set up a charter school where they only allowed children in, essentially, who were attention deficit disordered. 80% of the children were on Ritalin, a drug used, again, to modify their behavior so they can learn. What they found is, using a technique called brain biofeedback or neurobiofeedback, that they were able to modify these children's brain activities in this way. Essentially, it was a computer screen that would have like a visual image that a young child could relate to, more like a game than anything else. So you'd get a bouncing ball, for instance. The kid would be wired up. He'd have a 16 or 8 channel EEG plugged onto his head. So he'd have all these points covered on the head. Now they make really cool little helmets. They look like a bicycle helmet, so kids will tolerate them without all the electrodes stuck to them. But it's a nice little arrangement where they look at the screen, and as their brain hits the right range for that ideal state of learning, the ball will bounce. And the higher it bounces, the more into that zone the child's brain activity is. And what they have found is that with 30 to 40 one-hour sessions with each child, they're able to actually train the child so that they can literally go into that ideal state of learning at will. In other words, they don't need the biofeedback apparatus. It's like a training tool. It's the same as if you try and learn how to ride a bicycle out of a textbook. It's not going to work very good when you get on it the first time. But if you get on that bicycle and you fall down 2 or 3 times and you learn how to ride it at 5 or 6 years old, and you never picked up a bicycle again until you were in your 20s, and you grab that bicycle, you would immediately have laid down those necessary learning tracks to pick it up because of that feedback you get from the experience of actually all of your sensory perceptions being engaged in the learning activity. When you look at brain biofeedback, it's essentially the same kind of focused learning that allows you to retain, lay down those tracks so that you can go there at will. What did Minneapolis School District find out? After the first year, 80% of the student body was off of Ritalin, off of all psychoactive drugs. We're able to move gradually back into regular education programs, not needing the special education resources that otherwise would be demanded throughout their 12 years of K through 12 education. Now, why is that important? Obviously, for the individual, I think it's obvious. But as taxpayers and people concerned about what goes on in our communities, special education is one of the biggest growing costs around the country. It's something that other school districts should be actively engaged in, and it's something that you, as a listener to this DVD, could become an activist of one. Contact the Minneapolis School District, get information on this program, and get it into your local school district. You'll help a lot of kids, and you'll reduce costs in your communities, and actually begin to see technology applied in an educational environment. Now, since Minneapolis had started this program, a number of school districts around the country are starting to duplicate that program and bring it into the mainstream. But you know, it's taken 20 years from the discovery of the technology to actually getting in to an educational environment where it might be useful. And if you ask people involved in children's issues, this is probably one of the most important issues facing children in public education around the country today.
يقول بايجتش أن معظم الناس يعتقدون أن الشعاع الضوئي الخارج من التلفاز ضار، فترجع إلى الوراء كما يفعل البعض، وذلك آمن لأن الشعاع الضوئي ينتشر فتنخفض كفاءته. وللتوضيح أنك عندما تضع يدك على شاشة التلفاز تشعر بشيء من الطاقة. ينطبق الأمر ذاته على الترددات الراديوية، كلما ابتعدت عنها كلما قل تأثيرها. ويقول أيضا: إذا نظرت إلى الأمراض المرتبطة بالتوتر سواء كانت ذات أساس نفسي أو جسدي، سببها مثل هذه الإشعاعات والترددات، فتسبب التوتر الذي هو في الأصل سبب العديد من الأمراض التي نراها اليوم. يقول بايجتش أنه في منتصف الثمانينات كلف الجيش بإجراء دراسة بالتعاون مع جامعة يوتا لمعرفة طاقة الترددات الراديوية وتأثيرها على صحتنا وأذهاننا. وخلصت تلك الدراسة إلى القول أن كل عضو رئيسي في جسم الإنسان بما في ذلك الدماغ والقلب والكبد والرئتين يمكن أن تتأثر عن طريق الإشارات الخارجية في نطاق التردد اللاسلكي ضمن نطاق ترددي ضيق للغاية.
When you look back on Monroe's work, you know, Monroe was doing some interesting things. He was trying to stimulate the brain not just for learning applications, but also layering the information. You would actually see a brain wave was actually put on the material in such a way that the brain actually would lock onto that external signal. Now, the other thing that Monroe and others discovered is that you could combine binaural beat with flickering light. And let me give you an example. Most people think of the television set as a light radiator as pretty harmless. You know, you get back 10, 15 feet, as most of us do, and you watch a television set, and it's pretty safe. Everyone says, you know, it's what's called non-ionizing radiation, radiation that doesn't generate a lot of heat. You're so far from it, and the way energy spreads out, as it spreads out and you get further away, the density or concentration of energy decreases dramatically. This explains why on a television set, when you come up real close and you put your hand on that screen, you can feel that energy radiating, but as you back off, it gets less and less dense pretty rapidly, within just a few inches. If you think about radio frequency energy being broadcast from a radio transmitter, you know, when it starts out and you're close to the transmitter, you hear the signal real clearly, and the further and further and further you get away, the less dense that signal is and the weaker the signal becomes. When you think about energy oscillators and light in particular, think back a number of years ago. In fact, now it would have been in the late 1990s, there was an incident in Japan where actually children, 700 children watching a television cartoon actually went to the hospital with epileptic seizures. What caused those epileptic seizures when light is supposed to be harmless, particularly that coming off of television? It was the flicker rate. That's what was determined. The rate in which a certain segment flickered or pulsed, it struck what's called a window frequency. Within the range, there are certain frequencies like dialing up a radio. In between you get static, no signal, no clear resonance between transmitter and receiver. Yet when you hit the station, you get a nice clear signal. The same is true within our physiology, within our brains and within our bodies. Most energy is static between the stations. But when you hit that window frequency, you can trigger this cascading chemical reactions within the human brain. In that case, it took 700 children to the hospital with energy otherwise thought to be harmless. Capitalizing on this knowledge, people have developed technology that focuses in on those window frequencies for enhanced human performance, whether it's to help you sleep, to cause you to slow down, relax, and go into those deeper states of sleep, or whether it's to perk you up, to gain energy so that you can move forward in a day with a lot more vigor and a lot more energy, or whether it's for those accelerating learning applications where in the background you could be either playing binaural beat, or you could be utilizing this technology to feed information in, putting the brain into that ideal state for learning, and then bringing the information in a way that the brain can absorb it readily, retain it, and actually be able to use that information in a much more effective way in the future. The other place is just general meditation, where people want to get into those deep states of meditation where they open their consciousness to their more creative capacities. And these are essentially the ways in which these technologies have evolved. And they've evolved in a number of different directions. Light and sound devices, and we're going to demonstrate some of that a little bit later. Electrocranial stimulation, using electromagnetic fields to stimulate the brain. And we'll demonstrate what that looks like a little bit later. And also the concept of biofeedback, being able to get a signal in and being able to understand that signal in a way that causes us to slow down or to be able to learn how to relax. Stress is probably the single biggest killer in the world today. If you really look at stress-related illness, whether they're psychologically based or physically based, stress is the root of many of the illnesses we see today. And as our societies become more complex, the tools for relaxation become extremely important. So we're going to get into a little bit of that as we go through the day. The other area that gets interesting is this whole idea of electromagnetic fields affecting our body. And you know, this is a source of a lot of controversy and a lot of serious science. You know, behind me are a number of books and publications on bioelectromagnetism, electromagnetic fields, power line cover-up, cell phones, lots of information that has been published, some in the mainstream science community and other in just the mainstream media reporting on the findings. And what is being reported today is pretty exciting stuff. The opportunities to enhance what we are as human beings, to become more complete. I mean, if you think about right brain, left brain arguments, you know, that went on in the, I remember mainly from the 80s where everyone was saying, you know, women are more creative, so they have one portion of the brain that dominates, whereas men are more analytical, so another portion of the brain that dominates. And if you really look at these EEGs and brain activity within human beings, you will see exactly that. But does that mean that one side or the other side should be more dominant? It's really a function of our education system. If you look at young children, you see a more balanced hemispheric balance between both sides of the brain, the creative and the analytical. As we go through formal education, we tend to drift one way or the other and become channel locked into what parts of the brains dominate. Ideally, both sides work together, the analytical and the creative, and the idea of enhancing performance on both hemispheres is the objective of the science of controlling the mind for your own advancement. Understanding a little bit more about the body and energy interactions with the body. You know, the chemical model was the dominant model of the last century. This was the idea that everything that happens within our physical health and within our mind is related to chemical interactions. What was really a big controversy towards the end of the last century and not so much in the beginning of this one is the idea that energetically what happens to us has profound effects on our health and our psyche. If you think about the body, not so much from the chemical compounds to body cells, to body components, to body, but go a little bit deeper. Think about the body first energetically. Energy, atoms, molecules, collections of atoms, chemicals, body parts, and then body. Starting at the very lowest level, energy can have a profound effect in terms of how our bodies work. And sort of the dividing line between the sciences. You know, often the folks that had really strong math skills and capabilities in mathematics went into physics and quantum physics. Those that had lesser math skills but had good science minds tended to go more towards the chemistry and the physiology and the health fields, other areas. And that break point really segregated the knowledge in a way that was not a good idea in terms of the West, because we lost the understanding of what was happening behind those chemical reactions and how you might be able to manipulate chemical reactions, not with other chemicals, but just using energy itself. Now, the military actually commissioned a study back in the mid-'80s. It was done through the University of Utah, and it resulted in the Radio Frequency Dosimetry Handbook, published in 1985. Now, this handbook was actually put together to just look at radio frequency energy and its effect on our health and on our mind. And what they were able to find is that every major organ of the body, including the brain, the heart, the liver, the lungs, could all be interfered with or overridden by external signals in the radio frequency range within a very narrow bandwidth. In other words, again, looking at the analogy of the radio station and dialing through the stations, when you have resonance, a correspondence, a harmony between the transmitter and the receiver, that's where the energy exchange happens, that's where the action is. For a radio station, it means a nice clean sound. In the case of the human body, it means the efficient operation of an organ or the interference with its efficient operation for military advantage. Now, some people will remember seeing some of the devices that were announced at the very end of the last decade, one of them for riot control purposes, and it was a microwave transmitter mounted on the Humvee, and it was used for creating the sensation of heat energy on the surface of the skin. You know, and when you think about creating heat energy, what was it doing? It made you feel like you had 130 to 140 degrees temperature, very irritating. You know, in fact, burning the last time it was used to modify human behavior was back in the Middle Ages, and we kind of gave that idea up as inhumane. But we brought it back. Now, what they didn't tell us about that particular device is that same radio frequency energy, if you oscillate or you change the oscillation or the frequency, if you change the waveform and power densities or any of a number of parameters, you can create much different effects. The Radio Frequency Dosimetry Handbook, commissioned by the United States Air Force, explains what those varying effects are, whether it's interfering with the heart, the lungs, the liver, the kidneys, or in fact just controlling behavior by agitating people in terms of creating the heat sensation. But the idea of the military moving into this realm has become really moved from the area of science fiction to science fact. In fact, after 9/11, some other interesting ideas started being fielded. One of them was utilizing the knowledge of the brain to really look at, in the same way you walk through a metal detector to find out whether you're carrying the gun. The idea was being put forward by a group of electrical engineers that what we could do is capture the signal intelligence. In other words, the brain activity of those passing through a receiver, so that we could actually look at people that were experiencing high degrees of agitation or fear, the kinds of emotions that might make someone more of an interest before they board a plane. Although I think a lot of people have fear of flying, so you'd get a lot of false reads as well. But these are the kinds of ideas that are being kicked around by military planners around the world. When you think about, again, the body as in terms of its energy and the way we relate to energy, this is a very, very important concept, and it goes back to the very ancients. You know what? Earlier in this presentation, I talked about the idea that around us is 200 million times more radio frequency energy than the Earth naturally produces. That radio frequency energy has been made by mankind and only includes one very small part of this continuum called the electromagnetic spectrum. When you add up all the energy that man has added into an environment, it's a tremendous difference. The idea of being immersed in a sea of energy and not really sensing it or noting it, I'll tell you when you really see the difference. When power grids shut down, most people immediately notice how quiet it is because the refrigerator's not humming, the fan motors aren't humming in your computer, and so on. But if you think of the general state of your body when the energy fails, it's almost like you've exhaled as your whole body relaxes. Think about it the next time the power goes out, or if you want to run an experiment at home, go to your circuit breaker in your house and break the power coming into your house and notice the difference as your body relaxes, because your body constantly has to create equilibrium. So a certain level of stress is created within our physiology, within our bodies, to mitigate, to compensate for those external fields that dominate so much of our lives today. I mean, just in the room that I'm standing in today, we are surrounded by a 60 hertz grid, 60 pulses per second. This is in the high beta range. This is an agitating range for the human body. And so we're always in this constant state in the United States and Canada, where we have 60 cycles, where we're always just a little bit on edge, and we only notice the change when the power goes out. The other thing that you notice is the connection. When you think about what do most of us do when we walk into our house? We kick off our shoes. Why do we do that? People say, well, I feel more relaxed. Why do you feel relaxed? When you think about the insulators on the bottom of your feet, you're separated by the ground, you're separated from the ground. The Earth has a natural oscillation, a natural pulse. It's called Schumann's resonance. It was discovered in Germany, in Munich, in the early 1950s. And the pulse rate of the planet is 7.83 hertz. 7.83 hertz, right in the middle of the alpha range, the ideal state for human learning, the ideal state for a creativity, and it happens to be the literal pulse of this planet. As we separate ourselves from that and lock on to those stronger energy fields now that are 60 cycles and higher, it explains a lot of the general stress that we see manifesting itself in the industrialized world that doesn't exist in the less industrialized parts of the planet. So that's an important consideration. Now, there was a segment that was run on the Discovery Channel a number of years ago, and it was on the Iceman, and many will remember this. They found this guy up in the northern Italy, southern Germany, or Switzerland, depending on whose side you're on the argument, 'cause apparently it was right on the border. And melting out of a glacier was a person that was 5,000 years old. Well, they began to look at what he was carrying, and they discovered that he had medicinal herbs and other things that we know about today, but we didn't know that they had this knowledge 5,000 years ago. As they were doing the autopsy on this man, what they found also was a number of tattoos covering his body. It just so happens that one of those people in the autopsy room noticed that these tattoos lined up with acupuncture points and acupuncture meridians. So they decided to take a look and see if this person actually had illnesses or disorders that were associated with those acupuncture points and acupuncture meridians. Not surprisingly to me, but surprisingly to those that were in the room, was in fact that knowledge was there. These points absolutely correlated. This reminds me of another story, and I'll tell you the story and then I'll bring the two together. A good friend of mine was a physicist specializing in the effects of electromagnetic energy on the human body. His name was Reijo Michaela, and Dr. Michaela lived in Finland. He did a lot of work in Australia. He did a lot of work around the world, but was extremely well known in his part of the world for understanding the interactions between energy and human health. During his early work in the 70s, he began to take a look at mapping the human body. And what he discovered is all over the human body, there were places where our skin resistance differed. In other words, where there were concentrations of energy versus no concentration. He began to map these. He brought in graduate students, and this was done at Queensland University in Australia. And what he found was that as he brought people in, tested them, that everybody manifested these exact same concentration points of energy, and he began to map them. He mapped the front and the back of the body through a number of years, and one day a guy came into his study and said, "Dr. Michaela, why do you have an acupuncture chart on the wall?" And Dr. Michaela laughed and goes, no, this is my work. I've been doing this for 2 years, measuring skin resistance on the surface of the body, the electrical properties on the surface of the skin. And the next day, that student went away and he brought one of these old charts in. And this is an interesting illustration. It's one of these kinds of diagrams. These are by the ancient Chinese. We go back thousands of years, but not 5,000 years, not the age of the Iceman. So where did the Iceman in Europe have the same knowledge as those in China? Back separated by thousands of miles as well as thousands of years. And this is what my theory is, and this is strictly a theory, and I want to differentiate that from factual information, because that's what theories are, ideas that may help explain what we otherwise don't understand. Now, the arguments that we heard was, well, gee, how did the Chinese get the information into Europe? Or how did the Europeans get the information into China? How about this idea? Take away all the background noise, all of the things that we've created as mankind, take them out of the picture. And perhaps human beings, some human beings, were highly sensitive, were able to differentiate on the surface of the skin these very, very subtle differences that Reijo Michaela discovered 2,000 to 5,000 years after Europeans and Asians. Now let's go back and let's talk about this basic idea. This instrument, this is a pointer plus, and this is actually an acupuncture tool that has two functions. Its first function is to locate the points, to locate the acupuncture points on the body accurately by measuring the differences in the electrical properties on the surface of the skin. As an example, an acupuncture point on the index finger on this side of the fingernail is well known and is charted in all of the charts, whether they go back to ancient China or the modern world. This device, the Pointer Plus, is actually an electroacupuncture device, and the first thing I want to show is how it actually detects a point. And this will make a loop. So there's power coming through here, and there's a circuit that's completed if I actually go all the way around. So let me turn it on. There's power circulating through, and I'm locating a point, and when I hit that point, I get an auditory signal, and I get a bright light. Now what I can also do is by depressing this trigger mechanism, I actually send energy into that point that I perceive as a very, very light, almost like the dusting of a feather. Just a little slight pulsing sensation. If it's more than that, the power's too high and it becomes uncomfortable. But basically what I'm doing, instead of needling, I'm sending in just a little bit of electrical energy to stimulate that particular point. But all of the points on the body can be found utilizing an instrument like this. Now, this is sort of the modern equivalent of those sensitives that could actually locate those points by their hypersensitive touch or their electronic sensitivity and be able to detect those very subtle differences. Because these acupuncture points don't line up with the normal nerve bundles. They don't line up with muscle tissue. They don't line up with the circulatory system or of the body in terms of moving the blood around. This is the fourth system, the energetic system of the body, well known now and well understood. The place where I got my doctorate in traditional and complementary medicine was actually founded by a gentleman, Anton Jarosaraya, who was the first WHO fellow, World Health Organization fellow, to go into China and study acupuncture in the 50s and bring it back to the West in the 60s. But it wasn't until probably the latter part of the 1980s that the mainstream science finally accepted what the ancients have known forever, that affecting the energetic system of the body as a starting point is where health practitioners in Asia started and where they continue to operate today. This is probably the area where the most exciting breakthroughs in science will emerge in our lifetimes. The idea of electrophysiology, electromedicine will be the mainstays, replacing what we've seen in the pharmaceutical models and the chemical models of the last century. That's what I think we need to look forward to, and in looking forward to that, it becomes a whole different system of addressing health. Unlike chemicals, which work very quickly, this type of approach to health tends to take a little bit more time, and it's not just the effect of affecting the energetic system of the body, but also making sure the body has the basic nutrients available to it through the foods we eat or the supplements we take. Again, getting back to the things that we've sort of lost in our modern diets. We need the right building blocks in the body, then we need to be in the right energy state to take advantage of those building blocks to build a healthy body and a healthy mind. And that's what the future offers, and a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is about. This particular device is one that we think is quite useful, has been used all over the world, and there's lots of different versions of this, and we'll show another version of this as we get through the day.
قدمنا لكم مادة علمية أتمنى أن تكونوا قد استفدتم بمتابعتها. ترجمات حصرية تجدونها دائما على موقعنا نتيوب فور عرب. أتمنى أن تجدوا فيها كل الفائدة والمعرفة. ولا تنسونا أصدقائي من مشاركاتكم وآرائكم، وأيضا الاشتراك في القناة وتفعيل زر الجرس ليصلكم كل جديد. على المحبة نلتقي. كان معكم محمود العيسى، ودمتم بخير.